When Daniel contacted me for coming to this General Assembly and provide a bit the perspective of what's going on in Brussels, he suggested to use the title Legislation and Lobbying, which is about the work that we are doing in Eurometaux. And the why behind those words, legislation and lobbying, is quite obvious. Valid for all sectors, and I don't think there is any difference for your own sector. About 80% of the rules, the constraints, the standards, the legal obligations that your sites, in wherever place, in whatever place in Europe, have to apply, all that is originating from Brussels. So there is a cascade of decisions made in Brussels that then member states have to implement and transpose in their own national legislation, and this is the rule that you, as a company, as a site, as a plant, have to cope with. So it's important to be aware of what's going on, and it's important to be able to influence and get the signals, on the one hand, of what's going on, so that you, at the level of your own company, can think about, oh, what would that mean for me? Maybe I should anticipate the rule that will be voted in Brussels and then in Paris or in Berlin or in Rome, and then in 5 years become a legal obligation for me, so that you can anticipate with those signals and organize your business in a way that put you and bring you in a better position to cope with. And then influencing is also important, because very often decision makers make their own process, make their own decision without great knowledge about the impact it can have on industry. And that's why altogether collective actions convey a weight, convey a signal, convey a capacity for them to realize the impact their decision can have, and thereby we can tune, we can modify, we can orientate the decisions in a better direction. And this is why a key element here is the notion of volume, the notion of weight, of how much we represent all together. And that's why we organize ourselves. Industry has started to organize itself in associations. Your own association focus on the powder metallurgy, so we expect that when there is a powder metallurgy dimension that needs to be flagged up to authorities, that you are the place to elaborate that. And when you think on how to convey that, you can do that by yourself, but if you can integrate that message into the broader message of the metals industry, it conveys even a much bigger way. And that's the notion of pyramid of organization, and ourselves at the level of Eurometaux, with all the people we represent, and I'll tell you in a moment who we are, we very much work through alliances. There are many issues where we have a common view with chemical industry, with cement industry, with steel industry, and that means through that alliance building we form as much big voice as we can to have a bigger impact. And this is where you need to conceive the role of the organizations EPMA on one hand, Eurometaux on the other hand. We work hand in hand. Every message that you convey back to us, we integrate that in our message. But we are not going to be able to think for you. We are not going to be able, just by ourselves, the 14 persons that work in Eurometaux organization, to know the reality of the powder metallurgy, to know the impact it can have on your business. And that's why the exchange of information. We look at what's going on in Brussels, we disseminate that information to the members. That means Lionel and his team get that message and can then bring that to you, and you analyze, yeah, is it important for powder metallurgy? Yes or no? If it's yes, bring the message back and we integrate that. So that's the philosophy of that interaction. It has to be a kind of mutual flow. Okay? Now, I said who we are, you know who you are, but Eurometaux is bringing all non-ferrous metals together. It's about 500,000 jobs direct, and if you look at the value chain, we end up into about 3 million. That means it's important to be able to tell the Commission look, if you have a problem, if you make a decision on cobalt that's not going to be the right one, it can affect up to 3 million people. And that resonates in their mind in terms of social impact, competitiveness impact, and loss of markets, loss of economic power for the European Union. So this is the philosophy of who is behind us. Part of the message we give extremely strongly for non-ferrous metals, and I believe you must probably in a way or another be behind that, is to say that we are an industry that matters, not only in terms of jobs, but also in terms of how it can contribute to a sustainable society. Green growth, behind the word green, you have the word sustainability, you have the word circularity, you have the word circular economy, you have the word recycling. And we are an industry with that notion of recycling, that notion of closing the loop, being really part of the DNA of this industry. And together with introducing us, we always try to say, look, it's not only important in terms of jobs and in terms of contribution to GDP, but it's also important on how much we can deliver to the society that you want to build in terms of sustainability. Now, our organization, Eurometaux, in terms of membership, is composed of companies in the metals industry, European sectorial association, the big sectors like European aluminium, copper, zinc, nickel, lead, zinc, and so on. We have national federations, and then we have associate members. Yeah?
May I ask a question? You mentioned non-ferrous, but
yeah.
we still have a large proportion of ferrous. Does that not fall into Eurometaux's scope at all, or?
I don't know. If we go back to over 50 years ago, when the European history started, in the 60s, it was Communauté Européenne du Charbon et de l'Acier, coal and steel. That's where EU started, and at that time, the steel sector has organized itself through an organization that's now called Eurofer, that covers the steel part, and we cover the rest. But this being said, most of the issue, we worked hand in hand. I was this morning in a meeting with the head of Eurofer, but they are still two different organizations, but with many common issues. And when I was speaking about alliance, one of the biggest alliances together with steel.
And there are two things about Eurometaux, because Eurometaux is, in Brussels, the one which recognizes the specificity of powders. Because in Eurofer, we would be a droplet in the sea, okay? Very small. And all our nasty problems are coming from the form of the powder itself, because it is inhalable, and then you have a lot of legislation, carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, reprotoxicity due to the form of the inhalable powder, one. And the second thing, it comes from the non-ferrous alloys, which are the chromium, the nickel, the cobalt, tungsten sometimes, copper, for which they have special skills. For example, you will discuss the minus 0.01% of cobalt specificity, or the lead, the new lead legislation, which is very much impacting even in traces some of our alloys. The problems you find them with the non-ferrous parts and in the powder parts. And this is the reason for which historically EPMA made the choice to lobby through Eurometaux. Okay? But don't hesitate if you have questions, it is interactive. Huh?
We'll come back to that later on, but I can say that on that particular point mentioned by Philippe, everything that connects to what we call chemicals policy, there are two industry voices in Brussels. One is the chemical industry, CEFIC, and they mainly focus on the organic aspects, and Eurometaux leads for everything that connects to inorganics. And Eurofer is behind Eurometaux. The paper, the cement, the minerals industry, they're all standing behind Eurometaux because the expertise is in Eurometaux, and Eurometaux is the recognized body by the European Commission, European Chemical Agency, for everything that connects to inorganic industry. And alloys is one of the key elements for us. No, EPMA is one of the associate members. We call that associate members, and I will explain a bit later on what it means for us and that sort of relationship we have with our associate members. But those members behind that left part of the slide, through Eurometaux are able, and that's our mission, are able to convey one voice towards the European institution on the agenda that tomorrow is going to be the regulation for you. And that's the purpose of this organization, and that's the purpose of the complementarity between EPMA and Eurometaux. So what do we try to bring to the membership? First, the capacity to influence the regulation. Also, we give our members the capacity to exchange together, to network concerning what matters, what should be changed, what are the critical priorities for the metals industry, and by doing that, to unite all together behind a common message. We give you also the possibility to increase your own visibility in Brussels. Everything originating from Brussels, by standing within this network, whenever there is a need to express a particular voice of a part of the membership, Eurometaux can be a vehicle for giving you that visibility, giving you that platform, and join us in meetings in the chemical agency, join us in meeting with DG Grow, DG Environment, if it's necessary to flag up a specific dimension for powder. And then, as I was saying, give you the early stage signal about what's developing. This is a bit of the repetition of being able to combine in our voice all the dimension. What's important to note is that we try to focus on everything that's common to all the metals. If there is an issue that's specific to copper, the copper industry is better placed to disseminate that information. But we aggregate that in Eurometaux. And by combining the voice of the different metals, by combining the specificities of the different member states, we are able to contribute to the global picture of the metals industry. In all membership, the different four categories that I mentioned are repeated here, and I will just elaborate a little bit on the associate member. They are simply the organizations that are not directly a producer of non-ferrous metals. You are not a specific producer of copper or aluminium, but you are more a transformer of that, and you are very much connected to us. And this is where we have organizations like yours, like the battery associations, the rechargeable battery people, and some international minor metals organizations like the cobalt, the manganese, the molybdenum. They all are connected through that type of membership with a fee that depends on the activities that you want to be engaged in. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, that organization, what does it try to do? It's working on the vision that this industry can be a sustainable industry recognized for its innovative and competitiveness contribution to the European society. So that is really the driver behind us, and we want to be the voice of that industry to convey those messages with a certain number of value, but mainly to work according to 3 lines in our strategy. Our strategic plan for 2018, and it's kind of continuation from previous year, is built on that threefold aspect. First, we want to compete with other materials. If you look around you, you will see that everything is made either from vegetable fiber, that's the paper, that's the wood, either from oil, and that's all the plastic route, or from mineral, and that's all the metals route. And for the moment, and I'll come back to that later, realize that there is huge competition between those 3 lines to be able to say to the European authorities, I am a more sustainable material than the other. So you must support us more than the other. We believe that we have a number of extremely good arguments in metals, and I will elaborate on that later on. but be aware that plastic is saying the same, and that paper and wood are saying the same. And we compete very often on the same markets. So the first pillar, we organize the argument to be able to compete with the other materials. The second is to promote metals as part of a solution to a sustainable Europe. We hear very often low carbon in Europe is the future, circular economy in Europe is the future. We have extremely good stories to tell about all that, and later on Chris will elaborate a little bit on our big program to do that. And it's a big program into which your voice can find its place and be part of the whole industry, metals industry narrative. And then, last but not least, we say we can bring a solution to a sustainable society, but we want to bring that answer and that solution from Europe. And to be able to continue to operate and produce metals in Europe, we need to be competitive. And the competitiveness dimension, to ensure the presence of the industry in Europe, is a fundamental pillar of the activities of Eurometaux. And we have organized our working structure in such a way that we have, I will say, compartmentalized, we have segregated the activities in 4 policy blocks. Why did we do that? It's because it reflects the way the Commission, the European Commission, and the policies are developed. But there are many, many bridges between all those blocks. And part of the bridges is the role of Chris to help through communication and public support, public advocacy support, to ensure that when we speak about circular economy, we keep in mind how much it contributes to a low carbon economy. When we speak about how to organize the recycling of waste, that we know how to manage the potentially hazardous dimension of all that. So the 4 blocks is first energy and climate change. Quite important at the moment when the Paris objectives are high on the political agenda, where there are commitments by the European authorities. And when I say European authorities, it's not only the Brussels administration, because the Brussels administration always keep in mind that whatever they do and say is always with the blessing and the support and the mandate of the member states. So if the member states say to the Commission, you need to go by 2050 into a zero carbon economy, they will go. And that's what's happening. So energy and climate change is one extremely important pillar for an industry that is an energy intensive industry. So the weight of energy, the weight of electricity in our production cost is so high that this is a critical factor. Environmental health and safety, and behind that here the word also REACH. I don't need to tell you how much it can be having big impact. It can be disastrous if wrong decisions are made on classification of cobalt or classification of lead for an industry like yours, or for an industry that's built on alloys, where you have a small fraction of cobalt that can destroy and make every alloy carcinogen. This is where we fight. Now there are rules. We need to fight with the rules that have been set by the law. We try to change them. We try to make regulators understand that you do not assess a copper ingot in the same way you assess a gaseous pesticide. You do not assess a metallic powder in the same way you assess a liquid pesticide. It's different. And this is about what we are trying to achieve there, and whenever we can, change a bit the paradigm on how we are regulated. And it's a big fight, but the science that we are able to develop there is enabling to make some good progress. Then third pillar, trade. We are in this industry buying and selling worldwide, and I don't think it's any different for your sector. We probably have suppliers and clients all over the world, and that means be able to sell and buy and purchase in a free trade environment is critical. So one of the key objectives is to ensure that trade policy is enable free trade, but, and here there is a big but, and that's where all the action of Eurometaux is taking place, that free trade has to be a fair trade. So we fight every trade distortion, competitiveness distortion. I guess like everyone in this industry, you make business with China maybe, or you compete with China, and you very often see the way they operate on the market. Unfair subsidies, and this is precisely what we try to fight. And we have had major discussion with the authorities in the last 2 years concerning the potential granting of market economy status to China, which has not taken place, and I will elaborate on that later on. Last but not least, sustainability. Remember, we want to promote ourselves as a sustainable industry, as providing sustainable product, and we do. And we have organized the activities related to that, related to circular economy, related to assessing the environmental footprint of products. We have regrouped that in the Sustainability Committee, for which we believe we can organize and convey and elaborate extremely positive message. It's probably the committee where we are constructive in the sense of telling a good story instead of being reactive and trying to defend ourselves against decisions that could harm us. Not going into the detail, between those 4 blocks you have a series of subgroups, and Lionel has the structure behind that. And in your own type of relationship with Eurometaux, depending on the areas where we cooperate, you have full access to those groups. I say depending on the area where we cooperate, and the reason is simply because the status of associate member, recognizing that there is probably a financial dimension behind the contributions there, recognizing that some of the sectors that are associate members of Eurometaux do not have an interest in everything. We have organized the fee for those associate members, like yours, on the basis of à la carte buying program. That means that when you become an associate member of Eurometaux, you get the general information. That means everything that connects to the communication committee and the general communication of Eurometaux that Chris manages, plus 1 committee. And the starting fee for that is around 20,000 euro. And per additional area of activity that you want to be involved in, we add about 10,000. And today, based on the interaction in the past, based on the decision that EPMA has made, the status today is that you are involved in the EHS and REACH activity, plus energy and climate change. And I was telling Philippe and Lionel, if tomorrow you decide that you would prefer, because of the reality of your sector, that maybe the sustainability work is more relevant to you, or the trade work is more relevant than the energy and climate change work, we can switch. But once you are in some activities, when you are connected to some of these activities, you get full access, full involvement in everything that we do there. That means you participate, your voice is taken into account, and you have exactly the same right as the other members. So that means that it is your decision, depending on where the business is going, where the constraint, where the pressure are going, you have capacity to modulate and be a bit flexible on all that. Just to compare for the moment, a zinc association that a full member of Eurometaux is having a fee that's in the range of 85,000 euro. So that gives an indication of the difference. Okay, now, behind those 4 pillars of activities and the sub issues behind that, there are obviously priorities. And we have prioritized, not in a sense to say that we only work on some issues, but in a way that says there are some issues that are so important collectively for the mining and metals industry in Europe that we need to do everything we can to win on those. And put all the advocacy and communications efforts in those must-win battles. And what are they? They are about 5, and we can just add 1 this year. But in terms of issues, everything that connects to the circular economy package is critical. I said.
And maybe you can explain what it is for each, because these are the
I
burning topics.
do that later.
Okay.
I elaborate on each of them later on. But circular economy is really a strategy that EU is willing to implement and build their own economy into optimal use of the resources. And that means when you have end-of-life products, that you close the loop and recycle them. So it's about collecting, it's about defining recycling rules, and it's about defining the recycling standards, give access to the facilities and give access to the secondary resources. It's a package, and that's what we call that. The European Commission has called that the circular economy package, and it contains 8 or 9 different measures. In terms of trade, China market economy status. I mentioned that because in this business, China is becoming a dominant player, and what we want is to be able to compete with China in a fair manner. And this is why we did not want that market economy status to be granted to China, because that would mean that if it had been the case, we would no longer be able to use the trade defense instrument, that means anti-dumping and so on, that is available to European industry to fight against dumping from China and so on. So those issues are very much linked, and you were mentioning tungsten carbide dumping, and those measures are behind what we do there to enable you, when you realize that in a particular sector of activity you can no longer compete in a fair manner because the attitude and the procedure in China, and I mentioned China because 80% of the problems are from China, but this is valid for Turkey or Russia eventually, that we have here an instrument that can be effective, quick and powerful to put the sort of necessary protection level to continue to enable you to continue to be competitive towards that competition. Conflict minerals. I know cobalt is an important material for you. You mentioned tungsten. There is a big concern that has emerged in Europe that they wanted to restrict imports of minerals, and basically that were the treaties and gold, so tin, tungsten, titanium and gold, from regions that are conflict zone and for which the trade could finance conflict in those regions. So critical for us because behind that all the question of the sourcing of the materials. DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, is obviously a focal point over there, and you see quickly the connection with cobalt and eventually copper. And I will elaborate that later on. There is a big pressure to expand that notion of responsible sourcing. And this is something that affects and is going to affect everyone. Because the way they tend to do that is not only to say, are you buying from there? If it's the case, it can be easy, but no, are you buying from someone who might be buying from someone who might be buying from someone who is buying there? So it's all the value chain that is behind that.
It means, for example, for all our colleagues producing tungsten carbide products, in which you find, in average, 80% of cobalt. That when that is implemented, to put a tungsten carbide part, like even a small insert on the market, you have to prove that there is no atom in that part coming from XXX region. For example, Rwanda or Republic Democratic of Congo. I know, and this is very complex because you have to trace with certificates all suppliers, their suppliers, and their suppliers. And well, maybe you think, okay, I am a mean producer, I produce stainless steel. In stainless steel I have only nickel and chromium. But now European legislation is moving to expand that because they believe there is a big merit behind that. And in some cases there is a real merit. They want to expand to other metals, other non-ferrous metals. And that is to be followed. Our position, to make it short, within EPMA and within Eurometaux, is very simple. We are not against the philosophy of saying we should not subsidize children work. This is true. We should not subsidize war, illegal war or civil war. This is true and this is valid, and as a citizen I fully support this kind of advocacy. But for us, industrial business people, we need legislation that we can apply, that is not a burden of paper, which finally has no effect. We are not against doing something, but we want something simple, practical, and effectful. Ça va? Je résume bien là? Okay.
Next one is emission trading. You know, emission trading is for European climate policy the key instrument to lead to decarbonization of the economy. And for a sector that's carbon intensive, electro intensive, the price to pay by that policy can be extremely high and can be a killer for some sector. We speak to primary aluminium producers, that's really a killer for that. And last but not least, everything that connects to chemicals policy, REACH, metals, risk assessment, classification. I'll elaborate that a bit more in detail because I know it's critical for you. And we have on all those points made good progress last year. We continue to fight for that this year. And to those we will add for this year Brexit. You know the situation of discussions going on to define the way EU and the UK are going to cooperate after the Brexit. It can have significant impact for industry on trade question, taxes and tariff for everything that's moved between the UK and EU, so that can have a significant impact. What would be the impact of a material that would have classification status in one country, in the UK, and a different classification status in the rest of Europe? That can have potentially extremely damaging consequences for those industries. Can I just ask one question? Of those 6 areas, is there 1 or 2 that are totally irrelevant for your sector?
ETS is probably less important. Big members were following it always.
Behind my question is not
maybe no.
EPMA,
Well, you hear emission trading
companies.
Yeah, you hear emission trading system. Maybe emission trading system is less direct relation to our activities today. Maybe. Even still, for example, I am very much interested because as we produce powders and we start sometimes from oxides or then there is CO2 emissions. Okay, but maybe this one. Would you agree on that basis? The 4 others, no discussions. We are fully in.
For us, it's a great one.
What emission trading?
For Veganas.
Same for me. Yeah.
I think for large company like Eurometaux.
For Rio Tinto, Veganas, Eramet, of course, ETS is a big thing.
Yeah.
But if you make a quiz among our 200 members, maybe ETS comes at a lower rate than the others. But it is not irrelevant.
No. Can I just ask concerning the point that you mentioned concerning production of powder from the process route that I know the one SP, is it electro-intensive or is it a carbon-intensive?
EF.
Maybe. It may be both.
It's both.
It may be both,
The
depending on the source
the
of raw
reason I'm
material.
asking is that you know that in the ETS approach for an electro-intensive is a bit different than from the carbon-intensive, the difference between direct cost and indirect cost. And in Eurometaux, covering a sector that's largely electro-intensive, we focus more, we take the lead in Brussels in the fight on avoiding excessive indirect cost or ensuring that we can have the compensation from those indirect costs. So that's really the battle into which we are. So, since I hear it's all relevant, and honestly, the rest of the presentation, except the end, which is focusing on communication and a metals resumption project that we have, is going into the details of each block. Going into the details can maybe occupy a full afternoon for each of the blocks. I will not do that. I will try to give you the flavor of what's going on. If you have questions of details, maybe I will not be able to answer, but I'll give you certainly the direction into which we operate. And I'll start with for you, the most sexy one, environmental health and safety and everything that connects to REACH. So what we cover there is all the aspects that are multimetallic connected to those environmental policy. And I say multimetallic because that's really where Eurometaux is expected to give its added value. We rather want to make sure that we have the right way of classifying, assessing, managing the risk of metals compared to an organic compounds, while we leave it to the Aluminium Association, the Cobalt Association, the Copper one, to bring all the specific data that connect to their own substance. Eurometaux is more the umbrella organization, the door open towards the regulators, but the data have to come from the sectors themselves. And then our role is mainly to have the right scientific approaches and technical approaches to enable those data to be properly understood, used and valued by the regulator. And the examples behind that, the REACH classification, chemicals management legislation, industrial emissions, because many of those data are used by a part of DG Environment work that looks at how does that translate into the permit that you need to obtain for operating and decide what sort of emission, what sort of limit value you can have in your smokes, in the effluent into the water, how to manage the waste, and so on. So this part of the work is very much connected to the environmental department of Eurometaux.
Just a short question. Recycling will be also in this
Sorry?
recycling of the parts. For example, electrification nowadays is very important, and in future will be more. And recycling of battery, fuel cells, and so on is a topic that
For us,
can be also.
yeah, recycling is extremely high on the Eurometaux agenda, but more in the area of our sustainability activity, where we focused on the circular economy one. But obviously, when there is a waste dimension connected to the permit of a site, and that there are some, for example, solid waste, and that those solid waste can be purchased for being processed for recycling some of the materials into that, yes, there is a link. And when I was earlier on speaking about the bridges between the different departments, this is obviously an area where there is a bridge. So yes, recycling is high on the Eurometaux agenda because it's high on the Commission agenda, and it's probably where we can, as a metals industry, score well and differentiate in terms of positive sustainability impact, where we can score well versus competing materials like paper or plastic.
Yeah. Because there is always many discussion about CO2, how much is, if it's very high, some tax, some fine, but about recycling, there is, at least I can't hear a lot. If some production is not recyclable or not very easy, is maybe some tax, and if it's very easy to separate or very easy to recycle, to recycle, there is some motivation to production in this way, easier.
It's all being built in a way or another through the circular economy package. Okay? Now, I have one or two slides giving some examples of where we have been significantly involved and making good progress over the last few years. It's all the REACH, you know everything that connects to REACH. We have put together a forum bringing everyone together that is enabling to reinforce the voice and certainly ensure the alignment of the industry. We start thinking about how to organize ourselves towards the non-toxic environment strategy that the European Commission is preparing. I'll come back to that a bit later on because that is potentially a mammoth issue. We have huge credibility. I say that we are the voice of the inorganic industry that enables to open all the doors that need to be opened to participate at all the level, at European level and even OECD or UN level on the works that leading to classification, that leading to risk assessment, risk management, and even at the OECD level work that is connecting to life cycle analysis and so on. I will not go through everything. Some example of good achievements, don't know whether it's significant for you, I don't think it is, but we managed to get sulfuric acid out of the breath notes for the metals industry, the best available technique constraints for the metals industry. Sulfuric acid can be a potentially tricky issues for primary production, and we managed to get that out. Bioelution, I mentioned that. It's a concept that's extremely technical. It's for, I call that the professeur tournesol of our industry, that means the scientist of our industry. But if we are not able to value that concept, that's where we have the problem of wrong classification. In other words, what we say is that it's not because you have an intrinsic property of a metal that there is an impact. The impact is when that intrinsic property is released in, for example, the aquatic environment. And that bioelution is a mechanism that is leading to that release and that we manage to get integrated in the way assessment is made and classification is made. So that's really a major achievement for us. Without that, all the metals, and I repeat, all the metals, would probably be classified hazardous, toxic, or carcinogen. And that would be extremely difficult to cope with that. And we do that because we have a strong scientific pool in this industry that works extremely well together to bring the evidence, and through that evidence is convincing the regulators to change their mind. And if today the European Commission and the Chemical Agency come to us and say, please Eurometaux, in REACH implementation, can we work with you in developing a metal sectorial approach to risk management of metals? It's because they have understood behind all that you do not regulate a pesticide in the same way you regulate a metal. So this is a major achievement, that the recognition that metals behavior is different and requires different solutions for classification, for risk assessment and risk management. It's because we managed to get that through that tomorrow we will be able to have a way to come to a decision that's more meaningful than it would have been without that. This being said, I'm not telling you that all the decisions are going to be heavy decisions. But at least we are able first to make sure that we are going to be regulated on the basis of the data we are generating, and we are going to be regulated on the basis of a model that takes into account the specificities of metals versus organic materials. We always like to present a case where we have been able to make a difference, and I took the lead case. I do not know, probably lead is also important for you, no?
No.
Less. But
0.03%, you never know.
yeah, but you can translate that to cobalt. Cobalt is important for you.
0.01.
And it's a similar story behind that. Intrinsically lead as a hazardous property, here it's toxic for reproduction, cobalt it can be carcinogenicity, and the Commission is willing to propose that when a material contains more than a certain threshold, here it was 0.03, that automatically this will be going to have the same classification. For cobalt it's 0.01. Imagine a compound with more than 0.01% of cobalt would be classified as carcinogen, and all the consequences of all that. So what we are doing is fighting against that, and using the argument of the evolution, using the argument that an alloy is not simply a mixture of compounds. An alloy, you know that, it's not like water plus milk. It's different. It's a matrix that you create. There are links, and the release of the materials is not appearing the same way. So we managed to get for lead the factor 10 of improvement, which industry can live with, and for the cobalt we are fighting for the moment. But the consequences of the fight, the consequences of the battle, it's you at the level of your site, at the level of your operation, that are going to feel that. So that's why it is important that when you have an issue with a material, that the interaction we have between Eurometaux and EPMA, you can make sure that you have to organize yourself to bring the message back to Eurometaux that this is an issue for me, these are the evidence, these are the data, these are the impact, so that we can integrate that in our policy messages, and then fight together with you to get a good outcome. I will not go through everything. You will have all that in the presentation that Lionel is having and will be able to share with you. That means for those issues, water is an important one, because some important work is going to be done by DG Environment on the Water Framework Directive. That's going to focus on evaluation and revision of the directive, the status of chemicals, and a number of aspects that you have there. Most important of them is metal specificities. So if you have an issue of your activity dealing with water, this is an important topic on the table for 2018, and with the interaction we have together, you can generate your message within Eurometaux.
Just a question regarding that, is that only in the manufacturing stage, or is that also in the use cases? Because there are wear parts and so on that basically release small trace amounts of metals into water during their use.
For me, being a water framework directive covers everything.
Everything. So
You can confirm with me?
Yes.
Yeah. So diamond drilling, for example, where we use water cooling and then small particles of metal are carried away in the water, is also an issue.
Yeah. When it would affect only the emission at the level of the process, would be through the link between that water framework directive and its translation into standards through emission, and that you can find in the industrial emission directive and the permit that you must get on the plant. REACH 2018 is a pivotal date for REACH. It's the end of the R period, the registration. We move now into evaluation and authorization. It's different sort of work. That means the files have been registered, and the regulators, chemical agencies, start look at that and say, enough data, yes or no, more data needed, or there is a hazard, there is an exposure that's problematic, and that means we need to evaluate and regulate or authorize. There's been a review done, and likely leading to some minor change in the way REACH is going to be organized at the level of the Commission, but not major changes. For the moment, the focus is on improving enforcement of REACH, That means that there is a lot of pressure put on industry to make sure that the quality of the files is correct and forcing to more testing if necessary. Classification and labeling. I have mentioned the importance it is having for alloys. It is important for powder and the distinction between powder and massive. There is huge work done on all that for the moment, and we expect major communication or proposal from the Commission during the first half of this year. We are, you see the size of the document, we are in full and direct contact with the Commission on all that.
And this is very important for us. Huh?
I have asked Violaine is my EHS director, to more or less draw your attention to the specific cases that are on the table for the moment and on which we are working, and to flag what is relevant to you and see what it looks like. Cobalt, copper, lead, titanium dioxide, copper and silver containing zeolites and so on and so on. I will not go into the details. I will not be able to give you any detailed information on all that, but it's very relevant. Your membership in Eurometaux gives you full access, you or your representative gives full access to all the work we do that. So if you have a specificity, if you have a specific concerns, the door is open, the channel is there for them to be reflected and them to be part of the messages given by Eurometaux. I was mentioning non-toxic environment. EU is thinking of building on everything that they have done on classification and labeling to put all that into a framework that would erase every toxic substance from European environment. And imagine what it might mean if we have so many metals that are toxic. Can we go in a metal-free environment? That's not our purpose. So we are fighting to convert and change the philosophy of non-toxic into a philosophy of risk control environment. Putting on the table that Mother Nature has made metals like they are. They are in the environment, they are in the Earth's crust. We are using them. They deliver a good sustainable solution, but they still have potentially toxic properties. But the problem is not that they have toxic properties. The problem is that we need to have the solutions to avoid the risk behind those toxic properties to be a problem, and that we are able to demonstrate that we manage that. So the notion of risk control environment for us is critical, and getting away from hazard-based strategy to a risk-based strategy is what we are fighting for. Sustainability. Sustainability, as I said, is where we really convey the positive view that metals contribute to a sustainable society. What we have on the table of that activity is the circular economic policies, eco-design, because if you want to make something easy for recycling, sometimes just having a good design of the materials at the beginning helps. For dismantling, for separating the different components. Waste shipment, because recycling is still connected to waste policy. Yeah?
I have a question here. In our manufacture, we often use metals which we alloy. For example, we have iron with copper,
Yeah.
or iron with copper and molybdenum. So we start with iron, copper, molybdenum. We put them together. And once it is apart, how do you get them apart again? You just cannot do it. So even though that part is recyclable, this will no longer be pure iron. It will be iron with copper and molybdenum.
But that's a process question.
And then what do you do with that? Because once that is melted or whatever, there's going to be a certain proportion of copper and molybdenum in that iron. How is that tackled?
That is a
Or is that
technology.
going to be, oh, no, you're recycling, that's forbidden because it has some copper inside.
But that's precisely what we try to avoid. we do not want to stigmatize in recycling streams the containing of any material that could be hazardous. We know that there is some pressure to avoid that there are hazardous components that accumulate in the recycling loop. We are saying in the metal is not the case. We can have those three components, we can recycle that, and the recycling process sometimes is going to separate, sometimes is going to continue to build on that alloy. But that's technology. We have a big case where we have had to explain to the European authorities that you should not stigmatize, for example, lead. Because lead is a material that is helping recycling a number of other metals, simply as a carrying agent. And we told the Commission, if you prevent us to have lead in recycling streams, you undermine the capacity to recycle many other streams. So what we try as Eurometaux to convey is that recycling is simply part of the business, is integrated in the value chain, that we have the capacity to control the risk related to that, and it's not because it contains hazardous substance that you cannot recycle. So that is basically the message. Now, what is behind at the technology level is a matter for the recyclers. It's a matter for the OEBs, the Unico, the companies who are processing those materials to say, is it a problem for me, or what do I do for that? It's the market.
Okay.
I will quickly go on recycling, because I'd like to elaborate a little bit on product environmental footprint. From the discussion I have had with Lionel, I think it's important that I tell you what's going on there, because it could affect your business. I'll still go quickly through a few slides about the circular economy, just to start by explaining that the meandre, the slopes of the European policy are very often incompatible with the logic of the industry, but we need to cope with that. Nevertheless, it's clear now for the European authorities that metals industry is a champion of recycling, and most of the proposals that we have made to the European authorities to include in the package are or have been followed by that. And this, I was telling, there are many components in the circular economy package. You have an idea of how they are there. Hazardous substance, which is behind your question, is one extremely important for us. And we work together, sustainability department and EHS department, to make sure that we have a consistent set of arguments to prevent the negative perception of recycling of metals when they contain hazardous substances. And in all that, strong alliance, I was doing this to illustrate that on an issue like recycling, we work hand in hand with many other sectors, including with NGO. And we were quite happy that the NGO are even supporting the fact that in the metals industry, having hazardous material in the recycling streams is not a problem. Not the same as for plastics. So it's a good alliance that we have had with them. But I'd like to elaborate on other aspects that we are dealing with that. I'll skip 2 and 3, which are more specific and more technical. But I'd like to mention environmental footprint. For me, PEF, product environmental footprint, is, and I know I will make a big and maybe unacceptable to some shortcut, but it's REACH applied to consumer goods. What is happening there is that in the same way in the past, they were saying every chemicals needs to demonstrate safety. We know the hazard, we know the exposure, we control the risk. Here, there is a set of pieces of legislation being assembled, and it includes eco-design, and if you put all that together, there is a story behind that. And that story is saying, tomorrow, every consumer good, and what is a consumer good? It's a bottle, it's a computer, it's a car, it's a house, it's a pen. So every consumer good, we need to demonstrate an acceptable sustainability footprint over its lifetime to be able to continue to be produced, used, and imported in Europe. For one substance, it's already a mess. Alors, imagine for a computer containing, what, 20, 30 different metals, plastics, different components, but that is what they have in mind. And what is behind the word sustainability footprint? And that's what they are working on for the moment in an exercise on product environmental footprint. They have selected a number of pilot cases, and we are working on a pilot case on metal sheet to identify the different criteria that would enable to assess what is a sustainability footprint, an environmental footprint of a metal sheet. Some other people do the same on battery, some other people do the same on a glass, on a car, on whatever. They are about, what, 28 or 18, about that, different pilots. And then the Commission will bring all that, put the criteria in a shaker, shake it, and then come and say, this is how we need to assess the product environmental footprint. And tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, because that's a long process, you will have a score. And if that score is positive, you can continue to produce and use in Europe. It's oversimplified, what I say, but that's the philosophy behind that. And the reason why I say it's oversimplifying is that we start realizing, the Commission starts realizing it's a mammoth story there. And it's extremely, extremely, extremely complex. But you know the philosophy of a regulator. A regulator does not want to manage uncertainty. Regulators like to manage black or white. And that means they like to see, I have a mechanism where you can have points, and if your points is above the threshold, you get the green line. If it's below, you get the red line. That's the philosophy behind that. We are working extensively of that, simply to avoid that the criteria that could emerge from that work are stigmatizing, penalizing, or detrimental to metals. Our role is to make sure that the metals concept is properly assessed and valued into that. And behind that, I believe you, powder metallurgy, should think about whether you have some specific aspects that would need to be properly flagged up into those discussions. Because all the works you do on 3D printing and so on, if you do not have behind that an acceptable answer on the criteria that would be relevant and meaningful to you, it can be difficult. So I simply give you the message here that for me, out of everything that I have mentioned, it's probably one of the most important piece of work for the future of the industry.
I mean in the 3-5 coming years? In the 3-5 coming years?
Yeah, they are already running late. The pilot phases should have been completed by the end of 2017. So in the course of this year, they should complete the 18, let's call it 18 pilot cases, and then the Commission will start working on that. So I expect some proposals in the 2 to 3 years. Correct, Chris?
Yeah, I guess I can.
Now, the fact that there is a proposal, we need to see what it's going to look like, and then it goes through the regulatory process, which means that unlikely before, I would say, 5-7 years, it will not be a reality for you at a company. But if you want to avoid the boomerang effect in 7 years, let's say 7 years, it's now that we need to act. Because if we let the worm develop in the fruit today, that worm is going to stay until the process is terminating at Commission level, and then when something is in, it's extremely difficult to get it out. That's the experience. I will quickly and very quickly go to trade. Mentioning China, we managed to get through collective action to over 30 different associations to get a decision that the EU is not going to grant marketing advantages to China. Which means that now the focus is not specific to China, the focus is on having the right anti-dumping procedures and trade defense procedure. And we are working on the technicalities of all that to make sure that when tomorrow any of our sectors, it can be yours, is having or is seeing the evidence that they compete with a country where they distort the good practice, when they distort the trade, when they have, for example, subsidies or they are working on dump prices, that there is an instrument in Brussels that can be used to protect yourself and avoid the import of that materials at much lower prices than a normal market price. So that's intensive work on which we are working now. And I was speaking about responsible sourcing. We managed to get in the conflict mineral regulation all the aspects that we were calling for, and in particular recognize that if an industry has developed a self-certification scheme that guarantees that the material is not coming from a region financing through a way that finances conflict, it is safe. There is that important recognition, and what we want now is work on all the practical aspects of implementing that, so that we know clearly who and what is a conflict zone, that we know how the self-certification measures are going to be recognized by the European regulators, and so on and so on.
When shall it be enforced?
2019, 2020, I think, on that.
2 years. 2 years from now.
It was adopted last year. I think it's 2 years or 3 years. I have to check. But I think it's 2019 or 2020. But for the moment, restricted on tungsten, tin, titanium, and gold at EU level. But I mentioned somewhere, well, here, second pillar. EU is working hand in hand with the OECD.
Yes.
And OECD is saying that, what the EU has done on those 4 metals makes sense to do that on about more or less all the metals.
Yeah.
Copper are on top of the list.
The most metal in relation with what we are doing for the time being in that list is titanium, as you have something like 1% of the mean parts which are titanium original.
Pipeline is not only broadening to more than those 4 metals, but also broadening to more criteria. For the moment, the focus is on conflict zone, but it's just a question of time until it elaborates further development of that regulation to include child labor, impact on biodiversity, anything that you can think of. And it's all, I believe, it's all the policy of responsible sourcing of industry that is to be thought further.
Is there a similar regulation for crude oil, for example? Or people can apply that
Not to my knowledge.
essential-
Not to my knowledge. Not for crude oil, not for.
Yeah.
But for example, there is something similar in the States
Yeah.
with the Dodd-Frank Act.
Yeah.
So that's where it started at the end. Okay. Now, trade is not only anti-dumping, it's not only conflict minerals, and it's a quite large number of issues with a proliferation of free trade agreement with the countries that you see there in the slides. Still some work done at the level of the WTO, because there are some complaints going on with the WTO. It's all the notion of investment aspects, it's the consequences of Brexit, it's all the aspects of customs. You know, there are customs codes for almost everything, and there are regularly possibilities to renegotiate the customs codes. So all that is part of the trade portfolio of Eurometaux. So if in your sector you have specific trade concerns or issues, happy that you have a discussion with my trade experts, and that out of that you decide whether you want to be involved or not. Okay? I suggest to go very quickly on the energy part, because you told me ETS is not your maybe favorite cup of tea. Be aware that it's critical for us. The world is going to move into deciding how much the state aid are going to allow for the compensation for indirect costs. And behind that, ETS, there is all the rest connected to the clean energy package of the European Commission, which is now on the table, and look at aspects like market design, renewable production of electricity, innovation, energy efficiency for building in particular, and all the governance aspects of the electricity markets. All those aspects are being covered by Eurometaux with specific messages. And in all that, that's one of the characteristics of our organization, we combine action at high level through the capacity of having access to high-level organizations in the European Commission, to the top, access to the commissioners, but also combining it with technical work at operational level. Behind that, and I now hand over to, sorry.
To what extent can we push on the reconsideration of nuclear energy as a carbon-free source?
Yeah.
Because everybody seems to tiptoe there.
Yeah.
And I understand China is building 220 of those ones. They will be cleaner and cheaper.
Yeah.
What are we going to do?
No, it goes beyond the boundaries of Eurometaux. That's a fight into which we don't go as Eurometaux. But industry is flagging, and when I say industry, it's mainly through Business Europe, that we should not stigmatize nuclear energy as a potential source of CO2 energy. So there are strong pushes to maintain that, maintaining that on the potential agenda. But this being said, at European level it's extremely difficult because it's totally heterogeneous how the member states are positioning themselves. See the attitude of Germany versus the attitude of France. So just with that, how can you make a European policy? So honestly, nuclear question is out of the EU debate, even if there are some EU activities related to that. But more information, but it's never showing that as a solution to the decarbonization of the energy supply.
But they keep talking about decarbonization.
Absolutely.
And one of the main solutions is just not spoken about.
Yeah, for many countries, decarbonization is only renewable. For other countries, France, decarbonization includes nuclear energy. For Poland, decarbonization means don't touch upon my coal. So that's one of the most complex area of work because of the disparity of positions of member states. And in that environment, the message that we give us is we are an electro-intensive industry. Electricity is a raw material. The law of nature say that to produce 1 ton of aluminium, 1 ton of copper, 1 ton of whatever, we need that electricity. That's the law of stoichiometry, that's the law of nature, of thermodynamic. So please, regulators, understand that there is a limit below which we will never be able to go. And the closer we get to the limit, whatever the source, the closer we get to the limit, the more expensive the incremental improvements are going to be. That is what we can say as an industry. Now, Chris, you go on with.
Okay.
Good. I'll give you this.
Hi everyone, just while this happens, I'm the Communications and Public Affairs Manager at Eurometaux, Chris Heron. I joined to talk to Lionel and to Andrew, but also get the opportunity to give Guy's voice a rest and provide some variety as well. I'll just take you through the end of the presentation, specifically the communication activities we have, and questions about how we can include powder metallurgy within that as well. Just first, two quick topics. First, all Eurometaux members, we like to keep informed of our activities, the EU progress, achievements, etc. throughout the year. That includes two things: a regular newsletter every few months to give a bit of a snapshot of all of the achievements in one go, and then on the right, industry flash breaking initiatives on key topics of relevance in a bit more detail. Also, every October we hold an annual conference in a Brussels hotel, similar to as we are here today, focused on a policy discussion, getting all of the EU policymakers into a room to discuss an issue of relevance to our industry. EPMA are always invited to those events. We've had it on the non-toxic environment strategy to try and get there early and have a progressive debate. Last year it was on how can we really enable Europe's low carbon transition. This year it is potentially on recycling. And information about that will be provided. What we are trying to do with our communications in 2018, we'd like to provide our audience of policymakers with a bit better impression of what is Europe's non-ferrous metals industry. As Guy said, we represent a wide range of sectors, including powder metallurgy. It's not often clear to policymakers the scale of who we represent and the diversity of who we represent. The economic figures at a top level are quite impressive: 500,000 employees, over 900 facilities, 120 billion euros of turnover. What does that mean on a member state level? What does that mean in Germany, in France, in the UK? Is something we're trying to be more granular about. And what does it mean in terms of aluminium or copper or nickel or powder metallurgy? We're also trying to strengthen the link between metals and the low carbon economy, which I'll present on a bit more in detail now. And also to show that we do have a progressive view on chemicals management. It's not all about avoiding regulation. As an industry, we do believe that chemicals should only be used when they don't pose a risk to human health or the environment, but it shouldn't be that hazardous substances are stigmatized apart from that. So we try and give a vision there. But the main topic to discuss with you guys today is our communications project, which we launched last year on Metals with Ambition. We've launched this project to frame our discussions with the EU policymakers. I think there are three ways we can characterize the policymakers that we talk with. They have a low attention span, so they don't have much time for the messages we want to give them. They have an information overload, so they may have met with 5 or 6 other sectors that day. It's very hard to distinguish. And thirdly, they might often have a preconception of us as an industry before we get into the room. And the most pervasive one, the most common one we find, is the view that the metals industry is an old-fashioned, heavy industry of the past. The association of the heavy smelting and refining that we do, and the idea of some politicians still that what we should be investing in as Europe is the sexy digital industries of the future. It's not everyone, but there are some politicians who think, yes, we need metals in our electric vehicles, in our electronics, but why doesn't that metal come from China? Why not in Europe? So what we'd like to do is frame that to change that opinion a bit, to show that the metals industry is not just part of the past, but is also an integral part of the EU's 2050 future vision, and to also show that it's not just a metals industry, but a European metals industry. So Metals with Ambition is a project focusing on 2050. 2050 is a long way away, but in the eyes of the European Union, this is the key date after the Paris Agreement and the 2-degree targets, etc. All of the discussions are, what will the industry look like in 2050? We'd like to show in different elements how we recycle, how we produce metals, where the metals are used, how the industry can be there alongside the EU's vision. We'd like to show we're united in this, all of our sectors, around the common low carbon narrative, which is showcasing best case examples from in the industry. And that's what we've come to EPMA before to suggest and to discuss, is how can we incorporate the messages around the work that you're doing on powder metallurgy, on additive manufacturing, which is an element of the metals industry that we don't often communicate with policymakers at present, but which does show that we're a bit more diverse as a value chain than just this idea of heavy smelting and refining. So that's a bit what we come to talk with you today. It's still in fruition. This is just a slide. Why are we talking about 2050? Because it really is on the lips of the European Union. A month in February, Guy went to a high-level debate with all of the other energy-intensive industries, which is the second point there, where they were discussing how do we get carbon-free industries, not just low-carbon industries, but carbon-free industries. And from every industry, they want to see their vision for how they get carbon-free, which is a big challenge. Early next year, we expect there will be a new 2050 roadmap from the European Commission, where all of these questions will come up again. And in terms of all of the policy discussions that Guy was mentioning, whether it's trade or energy or environment, the perception of the industry is influencing our advocacy outcomes. And most energy-intensive industries, metals, chemicals, steel, cement, are perceived to be sort of dirty, conservative, blocking the climate agenda. On the right, you see there a mapping of influences on climate policy where every energy-intensive industry gets this negative rating. If we're more progressive, seen as more progressive, the paper industry is a very good example. They get more support from the European Commission. So the paper industry have a clear vision for where they go. This guy is the EU Innovation Commissioner, and he is saying that the Commission is fully supporting their mission. And on our side, we would like to develop a narrative to fill the gap between the other sectors. Just to say that our role as Eurometaux, we are very diverse who we represent. We represent all of the metals, we represent different value chains. We have to provide a narrative which is summing everything up, which is challenging. Already with the ambition, with the narrative, with the Metals Ambition project, we had a big event in October where we invited the key EU politicians to discuss energy topics. They recognized an attitude shift from the industry. We were focusing on how the industry can enable the low carbon transition, showing we're open to the low carbon debate. And that was a starting point for people to see, okay, the metals industry is willing to discuss these topics. The second thing, we've also begun to show our size. We've got a detailed map of where the facilities are across all of the member states, not including powder metallurgy at the moment. It's on the primary or the recycling production, but we discuss whether that's feasible to change. And also CEOs from the sector stating that they are engaging with the low carbon question. Also case studies from members, where is innovation happening in their facilities to lower their carbon footprint. And maybe most importantly is a strong narrative about the fact that the 2050 low carbon transition requires metals. It's something that's reported in the international press very frequently now, the fact that electric vehicles, wind turbines, solar panels require a demand increase in metals in Europe, globally, etc. So we discuss cobalt on one side in the environmental context. If you read the Financial Times or Reuters, all of the discussions are on where do we get cobalt for our electric vehicle batteries. We're trying to say that the fact is that Europe needs these materials. It now needs to focus on making sure the industrial base is in Europe as well to produce them, to recycle them. And that's what we're taking into 2018, where we've defined 3 messages that we'd like to communicate to the policymakers. 1 on production, 1 on products, and 1 on recycling. I'll just go through them very quickly. On production, we want to say, Guy mentioned we're very electricity intensive. We use electricity, not carbon, in our production processes on the whole, compared with other sectors. That means that if the EU gets its decarbonised electricity system in the future, which it wants, it should realise that that also has a knock-on effect of lowering the metals industry's CO2 footprint if the electricity is usable, competitive, etc. The priority should be making sure that electricity system is usable for us. The second point is to mention that metals production is essential for strategic EU value chains. I think that's where working with EPMA can be maybe particularly beneficial. We'd like to show that it's not just metals that Europe needs, it's a metals industry. We'd like to collect examples of, for example, industry clusters in member states where the automotive sector is working closely with metals producers, or examples of where the industry is producing a particularly innovative alloy which you can't find elsewhere in the world. And in discussions with the EPMA staff, we do realise that Europe is having a leadership role in the powder metallurgy, the additive manufacturing debate, discussion, and it's a question whether there are case studies that we can find from your sector to bring into that narrative and show to policymakers that there are areas where Europe really is leading. And the third point is recycling, a big part of our discussion. Metals recycling is important in Europe to ensure a supply for some of these strategic raw materials. again to talk of cobalt. If that was better recycled in Europe, it helps to answer some supply questions, the same for a lot of other metals. We'd like to show that the metals recycling industry we have can be a strategic industry for supplying these raw materials. It's not just the beverage cans, the things you put in your bin at home. Under development now is our strategy for communicating these messages to policymakers in the form of publications, in the form of events and debates, etc. The key question really is for us to the European powder metallurgy sector is whether there are examples from your level which we can bring up to this initiative and just show the diversity and the scope of the metals industry in this way. That would be a question to lead with. Yeah.
And maybe I finish with some wrap-up message that I believe are equally important and relevant to Eurometaux as they are for EPMA. That are for me the keys of successful advocacy. If you want to convince, advocacy is about convincing someone, and here it's about convincing policymaker. The first condition is that they need to know that you represent someone. So that means be able to demonstrate to the people you're talking to that the entire sector is behind yourself, behind the position, behind the action that you are taking, and in particular in Brussels, the importance of showing that the SMEs are behind. What European regulators don't like is just speak to a club of the big multinationals, but they know that very often the headquarters are elsewhere, the benefits go elsewhere. So be able to involve, demonstrate that you are supported by the SMEs of your sector is quite important. Second point, be credible. Don't come with just wishful thinking. Be able to demonstrate that you understand the objective of the regulators, because if you don't sympathize with the objective, even if you don't agree, they will not listen to you if you start by killing their objective. No, they will listen to you if you can bring some added value. And bring added value means help him achieve the objectives in the way you want. Very often the how is making the difference between a way that you don't like and a way that we can accept. So be able to come with concrete suggestions, and that's the next point, but factual evidence, data. I think it's extremely important. When I talk to policymakers, they always come, can you prove me that? Do you have the data? Do you have the evidence? It can be scientific data, it can be market data. So data gathering and data use is quite important to enhance your credibility. Then be constructive, that's the point I was just making. Come with solutions that help the regulator meet their own objective. When I talk to my colleagues and knowing that part of their role is to convince, advocate, I always say that you are convincing a regulator, you are convincing someone not with your argument, but you convince him with his argument. So it's always important to be able to translate what you want to achieve in his logic or her logic. And that is a bit the specialty of this work that EPMA and Eurometaux need to have to be able to score for you. And last but not least, the more we can be together, the larger and the stronger the voice, the better the impact. And that's where the notion of partnership, that's where working hand in hand, us supporting you, you feeding us with the messages, creating the demultiplication effect that is helping to have a better impact. So that's where we wanted to be, and thank you for your attention.